Welcome to today's webinar, The Trouble with Math. I'm Mariam, and I'll be sharing more on why students with dyslexia could possibly struggle with math learning. And I'll also share a few specific strategies that can be adapted to the teaching and learning of other math concepts. Okay, so while you listen to the webinar today, do enjoy your lunch. Okay, if you're having lunch at the moment. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put in the questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Okay? All right, so without further ado, let's start the webinar. So we're going to look at why students with dyslexia, again, could possibly struggle with math learning. So through my experience teaching students with dyslexia, I have seen that despite dyslexia being a language-based difficulty, we do have students who display difficulties in math as well. Okay. So, for example, Jane. Okay, so Jane has dyslexia, which affects her ability to read and spell accurately and fluently. Okay. So, if you're familiar with dyslexia, we know that dyslexia is a type of specific learning difficulty that is identifiable as a developmental difficulty of language learning and cognition. It is a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. Okay, so there are three characteristic features of dyslexia. Firstly, difficulties in phonological awareness. So they have difficulties making the letter sound association, and this affects their reading fluency. Okay, so if they have difficulties with reading fluency and they are trying to decode, words in a question, in a math question, for example, a lot of the mental capacity that's used is really just for decoding. So there's very little mental capacity left to understand the question. So sometimes when we ask students, okay, so what is the question talking about? What do you understand by the question? They're not able to answer us because they were too busy trying to decode the words in the question, and they did not have any mental capacity left to actually understand what the question is talking about. Okay, so it does affect math learning in that sense. Okay, the next characteristic feature is that they have difficulties with memory. Okay, so we'll be looking at that in a while. Okay, and then lastly, difficulties in processing speed. Okay, so what happens is when the child has difficulties with phonological processing, the child has difficulties with verbal memory, okay, and at the end of it all, it does affect how they process information. Okay, so due to a dyslexia, Jane does have difficulties with verbal memory, phonological awareness, and processing speed. Okay, as you looked at earlier, these are the three characteristic features of dyslexia. But what frustrates her is that it affects her learning of math as well. Okay, so Jane's slow processing speed impacts on how she processes math questions. So she takes a long time to understand questions, especially if they are presented in a rather abstract manner. Okay, and then Jane's poor memory also causes her to struggle with holding multiple information that's needed to solve a question. Okay, so this is especially challenging when it comes to word problems. So she would actually find it easier if the question was broken down for her, or if the problem was represented in images to reduce the cognitive load. Okay, so we'll talk a bit more on memory. Okay, so memory issues can also affect the learning of math. Okay, so when we talk about memory, there are three types of memory. Okay, so firstly, we have working memory. Okay, so this is the ability to hold information long enough to act on it. Okay, then we also have the long-term memory. Okay, so this is like the archive. Okay, so you pull out the information when we need it, and then we have the short-term memory. Okay, so once a task is complete, the information gets erased from the short-term memory. So me, I'll just illustrate a bit here on working memory in our daily life. Okay, so what happens is sometimes, okay, I'm not sure if you experienced this before, we could be in the bedroom, okay, and then we want to get a glass of water. So we walk to the kitchen, okay, and as we walk to the kitchen, we realize that we could have some competing demands, competing thoughts, okay, in our mind. So what happens is we think about, what we're supposed to do later, what we're supposed to do, afterwards. So all these demands, all these thoughts come into our mind, and it competes with that initial information. Okay, it competes with the initial thought that we want to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. Okay, so when we get to the kitchen, we're like, what am I here for? Okay, so you had this initial information in your mind, okay, but because of competing demands, competing thoughts, that initial information gets pushed out of your working memory. Okay, so say for learners, for example, if they are, let's say, working on a question, a word problem, okay, it could be a simple problem, just maybe 2 steps or so, okay, and they have read the question and telling themselves, okay, so first step, I need to do this, second step, I need to do that, okay, so they're just really verbally telling themselves that, okay, so they go on to do the first step. Okay, so what happens is that as they're busy trying to solve the first question, okay, they're working out, okay, the long addition or long multiplication. So all these are competing demands. Okay, so what happens to that initial thought of what's the first step, what's the second step? Okay, it gets pushed out, okay, of the memory. So because you're not holding the information, okay, long enough to act on it, so you're acting on another piece of information. So that original information gets pushed out. So once they're done with step 1, they may be like, what was step 2 again? So they have to go back to the question and try and figure out, what was I supposed to do? So there could be a lot of going back and forth, okay, when it comes to math questions, okay, because of their poor working memory. Okay, so long-term memory, information gets transferred into the long-term memory, okay, when there's a lot of reinforcement, when there's a lot of repetition, okay, but sometimes they will need a trigger, okay, to pull that information out of their long-term memory. Okay, short-term memory is really when you're just verbally rehearsing information to yourself, okay, for storage or for output. But the moment that information gets used, okay, it is no longer relevant to you, and that might get erased from your short-term memory. Okay, so children with poor working memory, they may face an overload of information when it comes to multi-step problems, and even simple questions like 87 plus 65, as you see on the slide. Okay, if they're not fluent in the step, they really could be consciously telling themselves, okay, first I need to do that, then I need to do that. So there's a lot of information in their memory, and they may not be able to hold on to it long enough. Okay, usually the rule of thumb is you need to act on the information for between 15 to 30 seconds for the information to still be in your memory. So if you don't act on it within that period of time, it may get lost. Okay, and then you have to retrieve your steps, okay, to figure out what you're supposed to do. Okay, so a child with a poor memory may be unable to remember elements of a problem long enough to perform an operation. They may know, for example, that they need to subtract one value from another, but they may not be able to keep those numbers in their head long enough. Okay, and then maybe perhaps when doing long division, a child could forget that he needs to bring down the remainder after subtracting. So he may not remember what to do next, okay, and then he may give up, or he may come out with the wrong answer. Okay, so automaticity, fluency, okay, in working out procedural steps, we cannot take that for granted. Okay, so to us, something that's quite simple, quite straightforward, may not be the case for students with learning difficulties, students with SEN. So we want to slow down, okay, and break down every step, okay, that's required to solve the problem. Okay, so difficulties with math can really be due to retrieval issues. Okay, it can be due to memory issues, and kids do rely on their working memory to keep up with math problems. Okay, so they have to hold on to the information like a formula or an answer from a previous step, or the steps of the problem itself, so they can use it later to complete the problem. Okay, so what happens is that if you have poor working memory, you may get lost in the problem. Okay, all right. So another reason why students with dyslexia or SEN in general could possibly have difficulties with math is because of other executive function deficits. Okay, so executive function consists of several mental skills that help the brain to organize and act on information. So think of it as the CEO of your brain. Okay, so it needs to manage all the different skills, and all these skills enable people to plan, to organize, to remember things, to prioritize, even to pay attention and get started on tasks. Okay, so it also help people to use information and experiences from the past to solve current problems. So in terms of the math context, we can, let's say a child comes across a word problem and he thinks to himself, hey, this is something that similar to what I've done before. How did I do it the last time? Can I take information from that time, okay, to help me solve this current problem? Okay, so that's what executive function skills help students to do. Okay, so executive function is really, in a sense, in charge of making sure that things get done from the planning stages of the job to the final day. Okay, so when children, they have issues with executive function, any task that requires planning, organization, memory, time management, even flexible thinking becomes a challenge. Okay, so the skills that you see on the slide here, there are actually some executive function skills that are important to learning, but more important in mathematics. So research has suggested that the EF skills, such as working memory, which we talked about in the previous slide, okay, inhibition or inhibitory control, okay, meaning you need to focus on the relevant information and suppress distracting information. And then we also have shifting, or otherwise called flexible thinking or cognitive flexibility. Okay, they all play a critical role in the development of learning skills in math, okay, where these skills allow students to apply the math knowledge they already have, okay, and then build on it to acquire new math skills. Okay, so when kids have executive function difficulties, they may run into trouble with math, okay, even if they understand it. Okay, so let me just give you a few examples, okay, of maybe inhibition and shifting. So an example of poor inhibitory control is when students are impulsive, okay, or impatient. Okay, they may rush through their homework, which can lead to errors. With math problems, the students actually need to have a good understanding of the direction they need to take, okay, the steps. Okay, but students with poor inhibitory control, they may not take the time to really look at the question, to really look at the assignment or think about what they're supposed to do. Okay, so they may just tend to just dive right into the question. Okay, they may take this number, that number, see this keyword, and then just add or subtract without actually looking at the question as in its entirety. Okay, then shifting. Okay, so learning new things involves shifting your mindset, shifting your gears, okay, as the topic changes, as the activity changes. So that requires cognitive flexibility. Okay, so it requires students to stop, okay, and reflect before they respond. Okay, but some kids with poor cognitive flexibility, they may fixate on what they already know. So they may have trouble stepping back and seeing that they may need a new strategy to complete the problem. Okay, so for example, let's say when a child is learning fractions, okay, they might insist that 1 out of 4 is bigger than 1 out of 2. So they know the rule that 4 is bigger than 2, but because this is a fraction, okay, a bigger number as the denominator means that the fraction is smaller. So the child needs to shift their mindset, okay, and keep this in mind and use a different set of rules, okay, for deciding which is larger. In time and whole numbers, you need to shift from base 10 to base 60. Okay, and then some students respond to problems based on habit. Okay, they may have learned one strategy and they use that strategy for all questions, okay, regardless whether that strategy is applicable to that question. Okay, so these are examples of poor cognitive flexibility. Instead of looking at each situation as different, students may give an automatic response. Okay, so when it comes to math, they may get stuck on approaching questions in a certain way. And this can cause them to perhaps miss out crucial pieces of information. Okay, right. Now, another critical aspect to math learning is attention. Okay, so just remember this. When there's no attention, there's no memory, there's no learning. Okay, so paying attention is the first step in the learning process. I mean, everybody fails to pay attention. sometimes, right? But some people, they fail to pay attention a lot, okay? So not paying attention to what you are doing can be a problem, right? So for example, not listening to the instructions in class can cause the student to do a task incorrectly. Okay, so attention is more than just noticing the incoming stimuli. Okay, so there's passive attention, and there's also active attention. Okay, so passive attention is involuntary. Okay, so because it's involuntary, it's easy. Okay, it is really an involuntary process that's directed by external events, okay, that stand out from the environment. So let's say, for example, now you're listening to me and you see a sudden flash of lightning, or you hear a boom or a thunder, sound of thunder outside. Okay, it's involuntary in the sense that you may turn to look at it, but it's easy in the sense that you can look away from it and continue what you're doing. Okay, so because passive attention is involuntary, it is easy. Okay, but on the other hand, active attention is voluntary. Okay, so it's guided by alertness, it's guided by concentration, and it's guided by interest. And it also requires a lot of effort. Okay, so active attention is really the ability to select and focus on what is important at any given moment. The ability to consistently, maintain that mental effort while performing tasks that require mental energy. At the same time, being able to inhibit distracting actions or thoughts. Okay, so when you're doing a task, okay, and the pop-up, that there could be many pop-ups on the phone, are they able to inhibit themselves, like resist the temptation to check their phone, okay, every few minutes or so? Okay, so it is a complex process. Okay, so it requires you to be alert, to select what you should be attending to, okay, and then to ignore what you don't want to attend to. Okay, and then at the same time, maintain your focus for the right amount of time. Okay, so attention is the first step in the learning process. So we cannot understand, we cannot learn, or we cannot remember those that we do not first attend to. Okay, so the question is then, how can we help students like Jade, okay, who has dyslexia and who also have executive function difficulties? Okay, so like Jade, there are many students with dyslexia who have difficulties with math. And about 50%, okay, of children with dyslexia have challenges with certain aspects of math. Okay, and it's not just the conceptual part of it. Okay, so it's not surprising that if child has difficulties in deciphering written words, they may also have difficulty in learning set of facts, symbols that are used in mathematics. Okay, so how can we help these students? Okay, considering that they may struggle with focus and attention, one way to get and sustain their attention is by creating multi-sensory lessons, okay, that incorporates a variety, okay, and learning using different sensory channels, okay, to help to integrate information. Okay, so we want to leverage on their interests, we want to activate their prior knowledge, and we also want to use concrete representation, okay, for abstract information. Then considering their memory issues, we also want to chunk material. We want to practice drills, okay, and repetition. Okay, this helps to transfer information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. We also want to provide opportunities for students to interact with new information, manipulate new information, use the new information, definitely. So this helps to transfer information from the short-term memory to the working memory. Okay, so hence what we can do is we can start with providing a structured and multi-sensory math support. Okay, so multi-sensory math is about using as many sensory areas as possible, okay, when you're learning a new concept. So the path to automaticity is actually strengthened when many neural connections are made. Okay, so the student may hear the teacher's voice or even their own voice, okay, as the visual component is engaged. Okay, maybe as the hands are also manipulating the objects. So when the hands are engaged, when all the many senses are engaged, okay, there is attention. Okay, so multiple sensory inputs create that stronger associations for learning and memory. Okay, so lessons are action-oriented, okay, with auditory aspects, with visual elements, okay, kinesthetic, and sometimes also tactile elements. and they reinforce each other for optimal learning. Okay, so when we talk about structured lessons also, okay, a structured lesson allows students to consciously think through processes which might be automatic for many. Okay, so we want to teach students patterns of thought, okay, the processes needed to perform math functions, math operations, problem solving correctly, and not just memorizing facts. Okay, so lessons will develop in a very structural, sequential manner, okay, to fill any gaps in the child's knowledge of math operations, math functions, vocabulary, and problem solving. Okay, so we hope that eventually students will develop that adequate math skills to become independent learners. Okay. Okay, so we can start the lesson with a problem of the day and quick warm-up activities. So this would really be focusing activities. It could be a relatively easy task. Okay? The idea is to just instill confidence, opens the mind for learning, okay, and builds that mental agility and mathematical strategy thinking and problem solving. Okay, so an example of a quick warm-up activity could be building automaticity with fact families and fluency with operations, the 4 operations, multi-step operations. Okay, so when we talk about math fact fluency, okay, the child is really able to quickly recall the 4 operations, the math facts of the 4 operations through conceptual learning. Okay, so fact strategies, memorization as well. So when students achieve that automaticity of their facts, the common benchmark is that they can recall them in about 5 seconds or less. Okay, so this skill is essential for students to master, okay, because it reduces the working memory capacity that could possibly be used for other problems, other questions. Okay, so it is important to note though that students will progress at different paces at their own rates. Okay, so as teachers, we need to provide a strong foundation for students, okay, through conceptual learning and strategies, and then we can follow it, and it can be followed by daily opportunities for practice, okay, in fun and engaging ways. Okay, but be careful. Okay, there are some common misconceptions about math fact fluency. Okay, so a lot of us seem to think that the best way to assess math fact fluency is through time tests. Okay, but time tests give limited information about what strategies the students use. Okay, so it sends a wrong message to the students because fast is not always best, right? So it's important to emphasize on the strategies used rather than speed. Okay, so research has also showed that time tests can actually have a negative impact on students and their progress towards being fluent in math facts. Okay, and we should also not use like fact drills unless the student has developed a very strong understanding, okay, of the concept, and they know strategies, okay, for the facts that are being practiced. Okay, so you can use math games, for example, okay, to help students master facts in a fun and engaging way. Okay, so it may seem that math fact fluency is all about memorizing facts. It is partly, yes, but it's also about understanding concepts and applying strategies. Okay, so math fact automaticity, okay, will come after a student masters these two, okay, understanding concepts and ability to apply strategies. Okay, so when you talk about automaticity, is the response is automatic. I ask a question, the child can give me the automatic response. But fluency is the ability to flexibly apply strategies across different questions. Okay, so when we want to build math fact fluency, we must first build that conceptual learning so students truly understand them. Okay, give students opportunity to use lots of manipulatives and models. Then we need to explicitly teach strategies. They provide lots of opportunities to practice and apply the strategies. And then you could also emphasize relationships and connections between concepts. Okay, and then get the students to explain what strategies they've used and justify their response. Okay, and then lastly, then work on memorization of basic math facts. They provide that varied and daily opportunities to practice using games, keep it fun, and if necessary, you can differentiate this also. Okay, so after the problem of the day and the warm-up, we can go on to drills. Okay, this can be both visual and auditory, or either one. Okay, so for visual drills, you can use flashcards, okay, such as vocabulary flashcards, or we can use like formula flashcards or fact families flashcards. Okay, so what you see on the slides are just some examples of flashcards. So it's the front and back, but you basically only show students the front of the card, okay? And then they should verbalize the relevant information that's required. Okay, but the cards should only be used, okay, after the concept has been taught and strategies have been taught explicitly. Okay, so flashcards can be used to stimulate and motivate students, okay, by helping them to learn and retain the information easily. They are primarily used for, testing and enhancing memory. It helps children to memorize and understand some imperative concepts. But it can increase the confidence level in students because it helps to develop visual memory. Okay, so visuals, images, okay, they are the simplest and the most effective way to make sure that the information gets stored as a long-term memory. So it does help to store information long. Okay, our short-term memory, it processes words, okay, and can only retain a limited number of information, whereas images are directly processed by our long-term memory. Okay, so the information gets transferred more effectively. We bypass all the different stages. Okay, I mean, if you want to use words, you can in bullet points. It's definitely simpler to process than prose, but that same information, okay, in the form of an image or a video is actually processed even more quickly. Okay, so because flashcards are visual aids, students are more likely to remember what they see. Okay, studies have also proven that learning through flashcards makes students grasp concepts faster. Okay, memory is enhanced when students see that particular image on a flashcard. Okay, and then next, when they see it again, they correlate the image and they tend to remember the concept taught faster. Okay, again, as mentioned, because the brain absorbs the information in pictorial form faster. Okay, when we use flashcards also, it's also important for children to understand, okay, that even though the syllabus might appear huge, it can be easily broken down, okay, to bite-sized chunks. So this is where the flashcards will come into use. Okay, but again, just like the math, fact, fluency, and drills, okay, be careful, okay, when using flashcards, because there is a possibility that the learning context may get lost. Okay, some flashcards are pictorial, some use keywords. But when too much information is provided to a child, they can actually compete for something called synaptic connections inside the brain, which can result in crowding. Okay, so when a person is flooded with information, okay, especially pictures all at one time, okay, they tend to get cluttered in the brain. Okay, and then the learning would not happen the way the parent or the educator might have wanted it to go. Okay, so think of it as your computer. Okay, so if you overload your computer, you get tons of emails, pop-ups, notifications all coming in. It will hang your computer, right? And then your computer will freeze, will lag. So it's the same with your brain. Okay, so when the brain is similarly like overloaded with information, it can go blank. Okay, and then learning will become a slower process. Okay, so when using flashcards, make sure that what you're teaching is clear so that the purpose is fulfilled. Okay, if not, the student would hardly learn. In fact, they will end up with more confusion with the unclear information provided by the flashcard. Okay, so next, before we teach a new concept, we review recent concepts, okay, to allow students to practice skills to mastery. So we give ample opportunity to gain confidence and fluency with recently taught information, okay, while weaving in previously taught concepts. Okay, so it can be a wide variety of activities to practice skills and concepts that are recent, okay, and areas that students have gaps in their knowledge or their learning. Okay, so here we can also model and practice vocabulary and math language. We can also include differentiated instruction here. So teachers can differentiate content. They can also differentiate process as well as product, okay, by planning instruction that considers students' readiness, learning needs, okay, as well as their interests. Okay, so when we talk about differentiation of content, okay, it really refers to a change in the material that's being learned by the student. Okay, so for example, if the classroom objective is for all students to subtract, okay, using regrouping, some of the students may learn to subtract 2-digit numbers, okay, while others may learn to subtract larger numbers in the context of word problems. Okay, then we also have a differentiation of the process. Okay, it refers to the way in which a student accesses their material Okay, one student may explore maybe manipulatives, and then another student could refer to information from a textbook. And then the last one is the differentiation of the product. So it is where a child differentiates in the way they show what they have learned. Okay, for example, to demonstrate understanding of the geometric concept, one student may solve a problem set, and then another could build a 3D model out of it. Okay, so then we move on to the teaching of a new concept. Here, we want students to connect to and to build on prior knowledge. So the new concept is taught at 3 levels. Okay, so the first one is at the concrete level. Okay, and then you introduce a concept using manipulatives, hands-on experiences. Okay, the next level is a pictorial level. Here we draw a picture or a diagram, okay, that represents the information at the concrete stage. And then lastly, we translate the concrete and pictorial information to an abstract form. Okay, here is where students apply the efficient use of numerals, symbols in operations, okay, for calculations. And then we could also explicitly teach the relevant vocabulary needed for the new concept. Okay, so this is a stage where you include presentation of new concept, guided practice, and independent practice if applicable. Okay, so just to elaborate on the CPA approach, the CPA approach is really a system of learning that uses physical and visual aids to build a child's understanding of abstract topics. Okay, so it was developed by a psychologist, Jerome Bruner, okay, and it's something that we use in Singapore math. Okay, many learners with dyslexia have strong visual and spatial reasoning skills. So they tend to better understand math concepts that are taught through manipulative or visual teaching strategies. Okay, using lots of practical resources like counters, unifix cubes, okay, will be beneficial for our learners. Okay, so the CPA approach builds on children's existing knowledge, okay, by introducing abstract concepts in a very concrete and tangible manner. Okay, so it involves moving from concrete materials to pictorial representations to abstract symbols and problems. Okay, so concrete is really the doing stage. Okay, so learners will actually use concrete objects to model problems. Okay, and then we also have pictorial. Okay, pictorial seeing stage. So here, visual representations of concrete objects are used to model problems. Okay, and then the more experiences a learner has at the concrete and pictorial levels, the better frame of reference the learner has for the abstract stage, okay, where he needs to represent his work in the symbolic form. Okay, and as much as possible, we should try to do the 3 stages of the CPA approach simultaneously. Okay, so let me just play this video. Okay, so this is doing it simultaneously. Okay, so apart from using the CPA approach to teach basic concepts such as addition, okay, multiplication or fractions, the CPA approach can in fact be used for word problems as well. Okay, so math word problem solving is an area of difficulty, right, for a lot of our students, a lot of frustration, okay, for many learners with dyslexia. So by breaking the process down using the CPA approach, okay, the learning becomes more manageable for them. Okay, so I'll just show you an example of how we can use a CPA approach in math word problems. So this is a common math word problem that requires students to use a particular heuristic, okay, which is making suppositions. So we have 12 cars and motorcycles parked in a car park. There were 40 wheels altogether. How many cars were parked there? Okay, so besides making this word problem solving experience multi-sensory and incorporating the CPA approach, we also want to highlight that there is a structure to solve such questions. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is at the pictorial stage, but it can be demonstrated at the concrete stage. Okay, so let me just explain this slide first. Okay, so for making supposition questions, okay, firstly, we need to teach students to explicitly identify such questions so they can choose the right heuristic, okay, to apply to solve the questions. So when they see such scenarios, they know that, okay, I need to make a supposition. And usually the first step is for them to assume the opposite of what the question is asking for. Okay, so just to illustrate the question, there are 12 vehicles all together. So we can use triangles to represent the vehicles. Okay, but at this stage, we don't include the wheels yet. Okay, then we know there are 40 wheels all together. Okay, so we could draw 40 circles, okay, but that's a bit much. Okay, so what I would usually do is I would start with questions with smaller numbers. So it's easier for them to manipulate at the concrete and the pictorial level. Okay, so it's more to build their understanding, right? So they can apply the strategy for questions with larger numbers without the need to illustrate at the concrete and the pictorial level. Okay, so at the concrete level, what I would do also is to perhaps provide students with cutouts of paper and maybe dot stickers to represent wheels, or I could get them to make 12 lumps of Play-Doh and then perhaps use toothpicks to represent wheels. Okay, so back to the question. Okay, so for making suppositions, we usually assume the opposite from what the question wants. So we can assume what the question wants, okay, but the steps are a bit different, can be longer. Okay, so here, because the question is asking for cars, we assume the opposite, and that would be motorcycles. Okay, so assume that all 12 vehicles are therefore motorcycles. Okay, so remember we had those 12 triangles, right, that represented the vehicles. So now that we have assumed that all 12 vehicles are motorcycles, we can add the wheels accordingly. Okay, so I will ask students how many wheels does a motorcycle have. Okay, so 2, right? Okay, so for each triangle, I will then add 2 wheels. Okay, so if at the concrete stage, I will actually ask them to stick 2 dot stickers to each cutout or 2 toothpicks to each lump of Play-Doh. Okay, so from here, they will be able to see the total number of wheels. Okay, so they will see that, hey, there are 24 wheels altogether. But if you go back to the question, there are actually 40 wheels. So I'll ask them, what happened to all the other wheels? I will scaffold them to understand that the other wheels belong to the cars, which at this stage is not part of the 12 vehicles, okay, because we are assuming that all are motorcycles. Okay, so we kind of need to convert some motorcycles to cars. So I will ask them again. So how do we do that? Okay, so cars have how many wheels? So we need to add how many wheels to each motorcycle to change them to cars. Okay, so we need to add 2 wheels. Okay, so what we will need to do next is to add 2 more wheels to each motorcycle to make them into cars, okay, until they've used up all the extra wheels. So at the concrete stage, they will continue to add the dot stickers to the cutout or the toothpick to the lumps of glue. So once they're done doing that, they will be able to see concretely as well as pictorially how many cars or how many motorcycles there are. Okay, so then I will translate the information to the abstract stage. Okay, so remember all this is done simultaneously, concrete, pictorial, abstract, right? So that they can see the transition between each stage, how they're all linked, and eventually they can just go on to just the pictorial or the abstract without needing to have the concrete to support them in answering the question or understanding the question. Okay, so at this stage, I will ask them like scaffolding questions such as, how did we get 8 cars from the 16 extra wheels? What did you have to do? Okay, so I'll let them discover that they needed to add groups of 2 to each vehicle from 16. So they can take 16 divided by 2 to get the number of cars. Okay, then I will also go through the structure with them. So it's quite predictable in that sense. So they need to assume the opposite of what the question is asking for. Okay, and then find the total number of wheels or legs in that particular scenario. Okay, and then find the number of extra legs or extra wheels. Okay, and then divide it by the extra legs or wheels that we need to add to each object. Okay, so with this understanding, I'll get them to practice other similar questions, okay, but still provide the concrete and pictorial support if they need it, okay, until they're confident, okay, to go on to the abstract stage. Okay, so this is an example of how we can use the CP approach, incorporate multisensory learning in word problems, to make it more engaging, to make it easier for students to understand. Okay, so because words in print, they're very abstract. So when we concretize it, it makes it easier for students to relate to, easier for students to visualize and understand. So it becomes less intimidating for students and they might be able to better access the question. Okay, so if I have questions where, we talk about the legs in the farm, right? So I will do the same thing. Okay, I could have a farmhouse and then just put lumps of Play-Doh inside the farmhouse. Then again, you can use toothpicks, okay, to illustrate the questions also. Okay. To move on to the next slide. Okay, so and lastly, okay, before we end the lesson, we end the webinar, we need to ensure that students file the concept away, okay, for revisit in the next lesson. Okay, so we can recap what was covered in the lesson, and then we provide closure. Okay, so we can also use exit cards. Okay, teachers can quickly assess how the learning went that day. So this information can be used as basis for the planning of the next lesson. Okay, so exit cards can also provide a level of differentiation, because I guess the questions that you put in exit cards, okay, the prompting can be personalized, okay, and it can be differentiated for students. Okay, so the responses on the exit card will provide the teacher with insight into the child's understanding, okay, and comprehension of the concept or the strategy or the skill that was being taught. Okay, exit cards also can develop an executive function skill, self-monitoring. Okay, that's another executive function skill. Okay, so what happens is that when students, they take their learning and they kind of like synthesize it down into a short response, okay, or they could draw out, okay, their understanding if they're not good with words, okay, as long as you are able to understand where they're coming from, okay, when they're doing this, they are actually thinking critically, and evaluating the day's work. So they are monitoring themselves, okay, where they are at in terms of their level of understanding, okay, and recognizing what they need, okay, to maybe bridge certain gaps, right? Okay, so with that, okay, let's do a quick recap of what we looked at today. So we looked at how math learning difficulties can actually present themselves in students with dyslexia, and therefore how we can use the structured and multisensory math approach, okay, to better support them. Some of the key components of the approach include doing quick activities to build math fact fluency, drills, incorporating differentiated instruction if necessary, using the CPA approach for teaching, and using exit cards, okay, to gauge students' understanding. Okay, so I hope the above has provided you with a better understanding of your learners' difficulties and their needs. And I hope that you will be able to adapt, the specific strategies that I shared. Okay, so you will need to adapt it into your teaching. You need to see how you can adapt it into teaching and the teaching of the other concepts. All right. Okay. So with that, okay, again, thank you everyone for your attention. Okay, and I'll now start the Q&A session. Again, I may not be able to answer all the questions today. I'll try to answer as much as I can within the time available. So I think we have about 15 minutes or so. Okay. However, should I not be able to answer your question, okay, please feel free to reach out to me personally. Okay, at my email address is there. Okay. And I think you should have received an email from me yesterday. Okay, so you can actually just reply to that email as well. Okay, so while I'm answering questions from the chat, okay, I hope that you can also help to evaluate today's webinar, okay, via this QR code, okay, that's provided here. Okay, so your feedback is valuable to us, and it will give us insights into how we can improve our future webinars. So we do have a couple of webinars coming up. Okay. Okay, so with that, thank you everyone. Okay, I will leave the screen here for a bit. Okay, but I shall start answering some questions that I see on Q&A function here. Okay, so all right, so there's a question: how do you teach division with remainder? Okay, I think my colleague Rebecca is typing an answer. Okay, so I'll leave her to type the answer and I can just share verbally as well. So if you're talking about concrete materials, okay, you can actually use base blocks. Okay, you can use base blocks to teach a concept of division with remainder. Okay, so what happens is that just think of it as the concept of area. So there's a length in the breadth and then the area, right? Okay, so the area would be that number that you want to divide by. Okay, so let's say, for example, you have I'm just giving out a random number, 340 divided by 20, say 340 divided by 20. So 340 will be your area, and then 20, let's say, will be your length. Okay, so you need to find your breadth, right? Okay, so what you need to do is you need to arrange your base blocks, okay, in such a way that you have a perfect rectangle or a perfect square. Okay, there are no gaps. Okay, if you're not able to fill up every single base block, okay, whether it be your ones or your tens or your hundreds, okay, those excess pieces will be the remainder. Okay, so that's for the concrete material. Okay, another way you can teach division with a remainder is using the chunking method. Okay, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the chunking method. Okay, the chunking method is where you teach students to understand the concept that you're giving away groups of something. Okay, so let's say my question is 270 divided by 17. Okay, so at any point, okay, I am giving away groups of 17. Okay, and I could have, maybe I should just notate, okay, or share a whiteboard. And I'm going to share a whiteboard, okay? Yeah, hope you can see my whiteboard. Okay, let me just close all this first. Okay, so you need to use these key facts. Okay, so what do I mean by key facts? Okay, so Brian Butterworth, he is one of the pioneers of this calculus, math learning difficulties. So his key facts, he claims that the key facts that students need to remember are the key facts of 1, 2, 5, and 10. Okay, so if students know these key facts, okay, they, in a sense, they don't need to remember any other multiplication table. Okay, because if you talk about the multiplication table of 3, it's made up of the key facts of 1, made up of the key facts of 2. If you're talking about the multiplication table of 6, okay, students just need to break it down to the key facts of 5 and the key facts of 1. So this is Brian Butterworth's idea, that you can use key facts, okay, to help you remember, you know, all the other multiplication tables. Okay, so if let's say my question was 270 divided by 17, right? Okay, so I first need to list down the key facts of 17. Okay, so if my first key fact, okay, so one group of 17 would be 17. Then I list my second key fact. Two groups of 17 will be 34. Then my next key fact is 5 groups of 17 will be 85. Yes, 85. Okay, and then 10 groups of 17 will be 170. So the idea of chunking is that you're dividing information, okay, into the different key facts, the different chunks. Okay. Give me a minute. Okay, so you should still be able to see my whiteboard. Okay. All right. So the idea is to give away chunks of 17. Okay, so you can ask the student, okay, if I were to take 270 divided by 17, okay, based on this key fact table, okay, how much can I give away first? Okay, so the child will see the key fact table and say, oh, I can give away 170. So that means the first stage is giving away 10 groups of 17. Okay, so I give away 10 groups of 17. Okay, so I could have, okay, bear with my annotation. Yeah, it may not be perfect. Okay, so let's say I have 270. Okay, and then I have 17 here. Okay, so if I were to give away 170, okay, because this is based on my key facts, I would have given away 10 groups of 17. Okay, so 10 groups of 17. Okay, then I need to find the remainder. Okay, so if I've given away 170, right, what's the remainder then? Okay, that means I have 100 left. So if I have 100 left, can I still give away a number of groups of 17? So if you look at the key fact table, yes, I can give away 85. It means I can give away 5 groups of 17. Okay. Okay, so we have 85. So I'm giving away 85. So this means that I have given away another 5 groups. So at this stage, I've given away 15 groups of 17. Okay, I've given away 15 groups of 17, and this leaves me with the remainder is 15. Okay, So if I look at my key fact table, I cannot fit 15 anywhere. Even one group of 17 is more than the remainder I have. Okay, so that means my answer, okay, based on this chunking method, okay, you're just giving me chunks of whatever the number is asking for. Okay, my answer is actually 15 groups of 17. So I can give away 15 groups of 17, but I have remainder 15. Okay, so my answer is 15, remainder 15. Okay, so that's the idea of chunking. Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for annotating for me. Okay, so this is one way. So there are two ways. So you can use the base blocks as a concrete method, the concrete way. Okay, you can arrange the base blocks depending on question, have your area and then have your length. Okay, and then like let's say just finding your breadth. Okay, and then after that, another way is to use the chunking method. Okay, so the chunking method, okay, it looks like the long division method. Okay, this vertical division, right? Okay, but if you just put the information there without supporting the information with this part, the key fact table, it will not make any sense. Okay, so you will need to have the key fact table to support that chunking method, the chunking working. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm going to stop share now. Okay, I'm going to look at whether there are any other questions. Okay, so another question, if my child has issues with number concept, okay, how do we help her? Okay, so when we talk about number concepts, it's really the basics, okay, the foundation of math. Okay, so the child needs to build up the number sense, he needs to build up the understanding of number relationships. Okay, so definitely one of the first things that you can do is to get the child to build up certain prerequisite skills. So some of the prerequisite skills could be building one-to-one correspondence, okay, getting the child to play around with unifix cubes, okay, then pointing to unifix cubes and saying the quantity, okay, and then after that you can go on to the matching. Okay, so one-to-one correspondence and matching is in a sense linked, okay, because from one-to-one correspondence the child will be able to see different sets. Okay, set A has this how many counters, and then set B has how many counters, and then after that they can make comparisons between more or less. Okay, other ways to develop number sense is really to build up the understanding of number bonds. Okay, and this could be done through a lot of concrete activities. Okay, so again, go back to that multi-sensory learning. Okay, then some of the activities that I've done with my learners is to teach the idea of numbers. Okay, accompanying it with songs, accompanying it with stories. So there's actually this book where it talks about number bonds. I can't recall the title of the book at the moment, but it's a scholastic book. So what happens is that in the story, okay, there's a group of birds, I believe, okay, who are collecting nuts, okay, to prepare themselves for winter. Okay, and then the story just goes on to like, okay, 1 + 3. If I collect 1, and then the other birds collect 3, how many will we have? And then another one, if I collect 2, these 2 other birds collect 2, how many will we have? So as we read the story, okay, I will use counters, okay, to get them to follow along the story. So they associate that abstract number, okay, that they see in the book with that concrete counter. Okay, and then apart from that, okay, they will also see how numbers can be decomposed into various combinations. Like 4 is not just 2 + 2, it can be 1 + 3, it can be 0 + 4. And then when they go on to 5, okay, they can see it's not just 1 + 4, it's 2 and 3. And then there's the commutative principle as well. Okay, so if we just get them to narrate, recite numbers, they are in sequence, but they don't have that understanding of what quantity this is, or if they are reciting the facts of number bonds, but actually not fully understanding what number bonds are, okay, then number sense is not being developed, it's not being fully developed. So you need to support it with activities, concrete activities, hands-on experiences that helps them to associate that abstract to concrete, okay, that number to a quantity that they can physically see, okay, and associate with. All right. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Okay, so the title of the book is actually Math Fables. Okay, Math Fables. Maybe I'll just type it. Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, so it's actually from Scholastic. There are other resources, okay, that you can use. Other stories. There's a series called Math Start. I'm not sure if you can see if I put it on the chat. Okay, so everyone can see. So it's called Math Start. It's another series that you can actually look at. So it's quite interesting, the series. I've used it to teach subtraction as well. So there's this book, I think it's called Elevator Magic. So I will use a number bond strip and just put it vertically. Okay, and I'll just put counters on each circle in the strip. Okay, and then we follow the story that the elevator starts from the 10th floor, and then it goes down to the 8th floor. So from 10 counters, it becomes how many counters? Okay, and then the character forgets something back on the 10th floor, then he goes back up. So you follow along with the concrete material, and then you illustrate it. So the concept of subtraction, going forwards, and then going backwards as well. Okay, so there are other concepts like division, even like geometry, spatial language. Okay, these are all in the Math Start series. Okay, so you can also explore the Math Start series. You can actually find the Math Start series in this store called September 21. It's a resource store which has resources for both math as well as literacy. Okay, all right. Okay, any other questions from anyone? Okay. Don't worry if you don't have a question now, but sometime later a question pops up. Okay, you can reply to the email that I sent you yesterday. Okay, and I'll do my best to answer your question. All right. Just to share with you that if you want to find out more about the math strategies, we do have a math certificate course that's coming up on the 29th of May. I believe you would have seen that in the holding slides. Okay, so that will cover the 4 operations, the strategies for the 4 operations more intensively. So like, for example, the chunking method and using the base block. So that will be covered there as well. We also have an upcoming workshop on the 29th of May. Okay, the 29th of May, that's going beyond dyslexia. Okay, so we're looking at ADHD as well. And just now we talked about executive function. So if you're interested to find out more about executive function, okay, and how it affects students, okay, you can actually also attend this ADHD workshop, because ADHD and executive function are also very closely linked. Okay, and then you can find out more about how to support students with ADHD, as well as adapting the strategies to support students with executive function difficulties. If you're interested to develop yourself more professionally, I think for teachers who are attending today's webinars, we have our specialist diploma, okay, and we also have the Master of Arts in Special Education that's delivered in conjunction with the USW. So registration for the upcoming intake is currently open. Okay, so our upcoming intake is actually on managing students with managing child and adolescent mental health, as well as those with social, emotional, behavioral difficulties. Okay, but don't worry, our MASCN intake is a rolling intake. So even if you miss this intake, you can actually go on to the next intake. But if you want to find out more about the specialist diploma or the master of our MASCN, feel free to drop us an email and we'll do our best to assist you. Okay, all right. Okay, so I think if there are no other questions for now, okay, I again thank you all for your attention, okay, and your questions, okay, and if you do again have any other questions that you want to ask, okay, do feel free to drop us an email. You can either email me or you can email our info@esacademy.edu.sg. Okay, all right, thank you everyone. Have a good lunch, okay, and I will see you when we see you again. Okay, thank you.